If my son-in-law is a general, then I'm a ballerina, my wife's father joked. The whole room laughed at me. Seconds later, the doors burst up, and they came for their general. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and immediately realize you're about as welcome as a fart in an elevator? Yeah, that was me stepping into the grand ballroom of the Marriott downtown. The whole place screamed money. Crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than my truck, marble floors so shiny you could perform surgery on them, and enough gold trim to make King Midas jealous. But all that fancy didn't change the fact that I stuck out like a sore thumb at a hand model convention. The silence hit me first. Not the good kind of silence you get when you're fishing at dawn, but the awkward, suffocating kind that makes you wonder if your deodorant failed or if you've got spinach in your teeth. Except I knew better. This wasn't about my grooming habits. This was about me being here at all. 20 years. That's how long it had been since Clarissa graduated from Westfield Prep, the kind of private school where they probably had classes on which fork to use for your caviar. And here I was, her husband of 15 years, walking into her class reunion like I was crashing a party I was never invited to in the first place. I'd spent 2 hours getting ready for this thing. Pressed my best suit, the charcoal gray one I save for funerals and court appearances. Shined my dress shoes until they gleamed like black mirrors. Even trimmed my beard and used that fancy cologne Clarissa bought me for Christmas 3 years ago, still half full, if that tells you anything about how often I get to dress up. But looking around this room full of designer dresses and custom-tailored tuxedos, I might as well have shown up in cargo shorts and flip-flops. Clarissa had already made her grand entrance 20 minutes before me. Something about needing to freshen up and make sure everything was perfect. Translation: she didn't want to walk in with me. Can't say I blamed her, really. Walking into this crowd with me on her arm would be like showing up to a wine tasting with a six-pack of Budweiser. There she was now, over by the champagne fountain, looking like she belonged on the cover of some fancy magazine. Her red dress probably cost more than most people's rent, and she wore it like she was born in designer clothing. Which, knowing her family, she probably was. She was laughing at something her mother said, that genuine, musical laugh that made me fall in love with her all those years ago. The same laugh I hadn't heard directed at anything I'd said in, well, longer than I cared to count. Her parents flanked her like bodyguards protecting royalty. Gregory Rowland, retired CEO of Rowland Steel, stood there in his $1,000 suit, holding court like he was running for mayor. The man had never met a conversation he couldn't dominate or a story he couldn't one-up. Next to him, Elaine sparkled in enough diamonds to fund a small country's defense budget, her perfectly styled silver hair not moving despite the air conditioning that was making the rest of us mortals look wilted. When Elaine's eyes found mine across the room, she gave me that smile, you know the one. The same smile you'd give a door-to-door salesman when you're being polite, but really just want them to go away. She leaned over and whispered something to Gregory, who turned just enough to see me, then immediately found something fascinating about the ceiling tiles that required his full attention. And there I stood, back against the wall like I was facing a firing squad, feeling about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. The conversations around me flowed like water around a rock. People chatting about their kids' Ivy League acceptances, their vacation homes in the Hamptons, their latest business acquisitions. Not exactly the kind of small talk you make with a guy who's more familiar with MREs than molecular gastronomy. A waiter in a bow tie glided by with a tray of champagne flutes. I grabbed one, hoping it might give me something to do with my hands besides shoving them in my pockets like some teenager at his first school dance. The champagne was probably older than some of the people in this room and definitely fancier than anything I'd ever tasted, but it might as well have been tap water for all the good it did my nerves. I scanned the crowd, looking for a familiar face, someone I could strike up a conversation with about literally anything, the weather, sports, the price of gas. But every time someone's eyes met mine, they'd quickly look away like I was carrying some contagious disease. It was like being invisible, except worse, because invisible people don't get stared through. The funny thing is, I'd been in war zones that felt more welcoming than this ballroom. I'd sat in bunkers under enemy fire and felt more at home than I did in my wife's childhood circle. At least in combat, you know where you stand, somebody's trying to kill you, and you're trying not to let them. Simple. Honest. Here, the hostility was wrapped up in polite smiles and whispered conversations, but it was just as deadly. A burst of laughter erupted from Clarissa's corner of the room. Her whole table was cracking up about something. Probably some inside joke from their prep school days about teachers I'd never met or pranks I'd never heard of. For a second, I thought about walking over there, maybe trying to join in, but something in the way they all leaned together told me I'd be about as welcome as a vegetarian at a barbecue competition. So I stayed put, nursing my fancy champagne and watching my wife shine in a world where I was nothing more than background noise. A forgotten coat someone meant to come back for, but never quite remembered. You know you've hit rock bottom at a social event when they stick you at the table that's practically in the parking lot. Table 23. I counted twice, because I couldn't believe they'd actually put me that far from civilization. If this place had a kids' table, I would have been sitting next to it, probably sharing crayons and goldfish crackers with some 8-year-old who had better social standing than me. The little place card sitting there like a white flag of surrender didn't even have my name on it. Just spouse. Not David Shepard. Not Clarissa's husband. Just spouse. Like I was some generic +1 they picked up at Costco. Hell, they put more effort into labeling the centerpieces. At least the roses got their full botanical names. Meanwhile, Clarissa was holding court at table 2, right up front where God and everyone could see her sparkling like a Christmas ornament. Table 2, the VIP section, the place where the beautiful people sit and discuss beautiful people things while us peasants eat our dinner and pretend we can't hear their laughter echoing off the chandelier crystals. Her whole family was there, naturally. Gregory Rowland sat at the head of the table like he was presiding over a board meeting, already 3 drinks deep and getting louder by the minute. The man had 2 volumes, loud and louder. Right now we were somewhere between a construction site and a jet engine. Every time he opened his mouth, half the room turned to listen, like he was about to announce the cure for cancer or the winning lottery numbers. Back in my day, Gregory was saying, gesturing with his scotch glass like a conductor's baton, we built things that lasted, steel that could hold up mountains. Not like this cheap crap they make in China. The whole table nodded along like he was dropping profound wisdom instead of the same tired speech he'd given at every family gathering for the past decade. I'd heard this routine more times than I'd seen my favorite movie, and trust me, I've watched Die Hard a lot. Elaine sat next to him, looking like she'd stepped out of a jewelry commercial. The woman was wearing enough pearls to stock a small oyster farm, and every time she moved, they caught the light and practically blinded anyone within a 10-foot radius. She had that perfectly controlled smile that said, I'm having a wonderful time, while her eyes said, I'd rather be getting a root canal. And there was Clarissa, right in the middle of it all, laughing at her father's stories like she was hearing them for the first time. She looked absolutely radiant, the kind of beautiful that makes you forget to breathe for a second. Her red dress caught the light every time she moved, and when she threw her head back and laughed, it was like watching fireworks. But here's the thing that really got to me. She hadn't looked in my direction once. Not once. I could have been doing the Macarena naked on my table, and she probably wouldn't have noticed. It was like I'd achieved some kind of superpower, complete invisibility, but only to my own wife. A waiter came by and set down my dinner. Chicken something with a fancy French name that probably translated to overpriced bird with pretentious sauce. The portion was about the size of a silver dollar, artfully arranged on a plate big enough to serve a Thanksgiving turkey. At least it looked pretty. I've had K-rations with more substance, but those didn't come with edible flowers and whatever the hell that green drizzle was supposed to be. I took a bite and tried to look like I belonged. Like I was just another successful guy at another successful reunion, instead of a fish out of water gasping on dry land. The people at my table were nice enough. A retired teacher, a guy who ran a small accounting firm, a woman who managed a local bank branch. Normal people living normal lives, making normal conversation about normal things. But even they seemed a little puzzled about why I was there. So, what do you do? Asked the accountant. Jerry, I think his name was. Nice enough guy, probably did his taxes on time and never got parking tickets. I work for the government, I said, which was technically true. It's amazing how many conversations you can end with that phrase. People either think you're boring as hell or you're hiding something classified. Either way, they usually change the subject pretty quick. Oh, that's nice, Jerry said, already looking around for someone more interesting to talk to. The government's always hiring, I suppose. From across the room, Another burst of laughter erupted from table 2. Gregory was telling another one of his war stories. Not the real kind of war stories, but the corporate battlefield variety where the casualties were quarterly profits and the heroes wore expensive suits instead of uniforms. Hostile takeover, Gregory announced, loud enough for the next county to hear. Walked into that boardroom like I owned the place, which I did, after about 20 minutes. More laughter, more clapping, more worshipful stares from people who probably thought a hostile takeover was the height of excitement and danger. If they only knew what real hostility looked like. What real danger felt like when it was breathing down your neck and shooting at you from 3 different directions. But that was the thing about this crowd. They lived in a world where the biggest crisis was a stock market dip or a delayed flight to their vacation home. They talked about battles they'd never fought and victories that never required them to risk anything more valuable than money. I pushed the fancy chicken around my plate and tried not to think about all the places I'd been, all the things I'd seen, all the missions that would never make it into any slideshow or dinner conversation. Because in this room, at this table, wearing this label that just said spouse, none of that mattered. I was just the guy who married above his station and had the audacity to show up. The lights dimmed, and suddenly everyone got as quiet as kids during a pop quiz. A massive screen descended from the ceiling like some kind of technological curtain call, and the MC, a guy who probably peaked in high school and was still riding that wave 20 years later, grabbed the microphone with the enthusiasm of a game show host on too much caffeine. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for our trip down memory lane, he announced, his voice echoing through the ballroom like he was introducing the main event at Madison Square Garden. Let's see how far we've all come. Oh boy, here we go. Nothing says subtle humiliation like a public slideshow documenting everyone else's success while you sit in the back row eating overpriced chicken. The first photos were harmless enough. Classic high school yearbook shots that made everyone look like they were auditioning for a cheesy 80s movie. Big hair, braces, questionable fashion choices that probably seemed cutting edge at the time, but now looked like Halloween costumes. The crowd oohed and awed at each picture, pointing at themselves and their friends like archaeologists discovering ancient artifacts. "Oh my God, look at my bangs," squealed some woman from table 7, loud enough to wake the dead. Everyone laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd heard since sliced bread was invented. Then came the graduation photos. Caps and gowns, proud parents, the whole Norman Rockwell fantasy of American achievement. Clarissa looked absolutely stunning in her graduation photo. She was always photogenic, even as a teenager. Her smile could have powered the entire hotel for a week. But here's where things started getting interesting, and by interesting, I mean about as comfortable as a root canal performed by a blindfolded dentist. The slideshow shifted from "remember when" to "look at us now," and suddenly we weren't just taking a stroll down memory lane. We were running a full marathon through everyone's highlight reel. Wedding photos started flashing by like a romantic montage from a movie nobody asked to see. Designer dresses, exotic locations, ceremonies that probably cost more than most people's houses. Each couple looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine ad for the perfect life. And then, surprise, surprise, there was our wedding photo. All 2 seconds of it. Blink and you'd miss it, sandwiched between Susan Morrison's 3rd wedding in Tuscany and the Henderson's beach ceremony in Maui. Our photo looked like it came from a different planet. Small church, simple dress, me in my dress blues looking like I'd rather be anywhere else. Which, to be honest, I probably would have, considering I was about to marry into a family that treated me like I had a contagious disease. The crowd gave our photo the same enthusiasm you'd reserve for watching paint dry. No os, no comments about how beautiful Clarissa looked, no acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, we belonged in this slideshow too. Just silence and the sound of people shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. But wait, it gets better. Next came the baby photos. Cute little bundles of joy in designer nurseries, held by glowing parents who probably had nannies waiting in the wings. Each kid looked like they were already being groomed for their own prep school graduation photo. The ahs were deafening. You'd think someone was giving away free money. Then came the career showcase, and this is where the night really went off the rails. This wasn't just show and tell anymore. This was full contact bragging with a side of humble bragging and a dessert course of not so humble bragging. Dr. Patricia Henley flashed across the screen in her white coat, standing in front of some fancy hospital that probably charged $1,000 just to park in their lot. The crowd applauded like she'd just cured cancer instead of choosing a profession that pays really well. Next up was Marcus Chun, tech founder extraordinaire, standing in front of a wall of computers that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. His company logo was bigger than my kitchen, and according to the caption, he'd sold it to some Silicon Valley giant for enough money to buy a small country. Then came the lawyers, and boy, did they love their lawyers. The screen lit up with images of corner offices, law libraries that looked like museums, and enough legal degrees to wallpaper a mansion. Each photo got more applause than the last, like we were watching the Academy Awards for most successful life choices. And then came the crown jewel, the golden boy himself, Ryan Matthews. Clarissa's ex-boyfriend from high school, now some hotshot attorney in Manhattan with a smile that probably cost more to maintain than my annual salary. The photo showed him in what had to be the most expensive suit ever created, standing in an office with a view of Central Park that made my apartment look like a broom closet. The crowd went absolutely wild. I'm talking standing ovation, whistling, the whole 9 yards. You'd think he'd just announced he was running for president and promising everyone free money and eternal youth. Gregory practically levitated out of his chair, raising his scotch glass like he was toasting the second coming. "Now that's what I call success," he bellowed, his voice carrying across the room like a foghorn. A real man with a real career. The applause went on forever. People were clapping so hard I thought their hands might fall off. Someone even shouted speech, like we were at a political rally. And through it all, I sat at table 23, watching this parade of achievement march by without me. No photo of me in uniform. No mention of 22 years of service. No acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, there were other ways to measure a man's worth besides his bank account and his corner office. Just silence. The kind of silence that says everything you need to know about where you stand in the world. The dessert course was some fancy French thing that looked like it belonged in an art museum rather than on a dinner plate. 3 tiny spoonfuls of chocolate something with gold flakes that probably cost more per ounce than actual gold. I was pushing it around with my fork, trying to figure out if it was supposed to be eaten or admired, when the MC decided it was time for the evening's grand finale. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, tapping his champagne flute with a butter knife like he was calling a board meeting to order. "Before we wrap up this incredible evening, I think it's time for some special recognition." Oh great, more recognition. More applause for people who already had enough validation to power a small city. I braced myself for another round of corporate cheerleading and humble bragging disguised as gratitude. The MC, whose name was apparently Brad, because of course it was Brad, had that smarmy smile that screamed, former class president who never got over it. He was the kind of guy who probably still had his Letterman jacket hanging in his closet and told the same 3 stories about his glory days to anyone who'd listen. "Now, we've heard about all the amazing achievements of our graduating class," Brad continued, his voice carrying that fake enthusiasm that made my teeth itch. "Doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs, we've got it all. But let's not forget about the families behind these incredible people." Families. Right. Because apparently, some families were more worth mentioning than others. "Speaking of families," Brad went on, clearly building up to something he thought was hilarious. "Let's give a special toast to the Rowland family, Gregory and Elaine, pillars of our community, and their brilliant daughter Clarissa." The crowd erupted in applause like Gregory had just announced he was donating a wing to the local hospital. Gregory stood up, practically glowing with pride, his chest puffed out like a rooster in a chicken coop. And every time I'd had to explain to someone why we couldn't just download more RAM to fix their computer problems. Saturday morning came with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes you want to drink coffee on your porch and pretend you're in a Norman Rockwell painting. Except instead of contemplating the simple pleasures of small-town life, I was sipping my medium roast and waiting for the digital equivalent of the Hindenburg disaster to unfold across the street. I'd set up camp on my apartment balcony with a perfect view of the Henderson Tech building, armed with nothing but caffeine, a day-old bagel, and the kind of anticipation usually reserved for watching your favorite team in the playoffs. The first sign that my carefully orchestrated exodus was bearing fruit came at exactly 10:47 a.m., when I watched Jerry from maintenance sprint across the parking lot like his pants were on fire. Now, Jerry was not what you'd call a sprinting kind of guy. More of a leisurely stroll, stop to chat with everyone, take your time because life's too short kind of fellow. Seeing him move with that kind of urgency was like watching a sloth discover Red Bull, and I knew immediately that something beautiful was happening inside that building. My phone, which had been sitting quietly on the patio table like a well-behaved pet, suddenly came to life with the enthusiasm of a caffeinated teenager. The notifications started rolling in faster than Tiffany could apply her morning bronzer. Each one a little digital love letter from my former colleagues who were just beginning to realize that their technology infrastructure had about as much stability as a house of cards in a hurricane. The first message came from Marcus in accounting, and I could practically hear the panic in his typing. Hey, random Q. Where's the invoice system? It's showing everything in what I think might be ancient Sumerian, and the numbers keep changing into what appear to be emoji faces. Please tell me you know what's happening, because I'm pretty sure our quarterly reports aren't supposed to include 17 crying laughing faces and a taco. I took a long, satisfying sip of coffee and watched another employee. This one I didn't recognize, probably one of Tiffany's recent hires, burst through the front doors like he was escaping from a haunted house. The poor guy was clutching a laptop against his chest and looking around the parking lot like he expected to find a tech support fairy godmother who could wave a magic wand and make all his problems disappear. The next notification came from Rudy in legal, who had apparently discovered that the contract management system had developed what could only be described as a severe case of digital dementia. Are you available for a consult? Our legal documents database seems to think that all of our contracts are now written in Pig Latin, and every client name has been replaced with characters from The Office. I'm looking at a multi-million-dollar deal with someone named Dwight K. Schrute, and I'm not sure how to explain this to the partners. I had to give Rudy credit for his diplomatic choice of words. Consult. Like I was some kind of freelance troubleshooter who just happened to be available on a Saturday morning, rather than the recently terminated employee who had spent 3 years preventing exactly this kind of catastrophic system failure from happening in the first place. But the real masterpiece came from my wife, Ellie, whose message managed to capture the perfect combination of confusion, concern, and dawning realization that maybe, just maybe, her husband wasn't quite the innocent victim of corporate downsizing that she'd initially thought. Did you do something? Because Tiffany just called me crying about digital terrorism and something about the coffee machine in the break room gaining sentience and demanding workers' compensation. She wanted to know if you had any emergency contact information for the computer gods and whether we keep a backup copy of you somewhere. I told her I'd ask, but honestly, I'm starting to think I married either a genius or a supervillain, and I'm not sure which one I'm hoping for at this point. I leaned back in my patio chair and smiled at that one. Digital terrorism. That was rich, coming from someone who thought the cloud was just a really big computer floating somewhere in the sky, and that rebooting meant buying new shoes. The coffee machine thing was particularly beautiful. That was one of my little jokes from about 6 months ago when I'd connected our break room appliances to the network monitoring system. Completely harmless, just a way to track usage patterns and maybe get early warning if something was about to break down. But now that my oversight scripts were gone, the monitoring system was probably interpreting the coffee machine's normal operational data as some kind of artificial intelligence uprising. The beautiful thing about being a systems administrator is that you get to see how all the digital pieces fit together, how every little automated process depends on every other automated process in ways that would make a Rube Goldberg machine look simple by comparison. When you remove one critical component, say, the person who built and maintains most of those automated processes, the whole thing doesn't just break down gracefully. It fails in the most spectacular, unpredictable, and entertainingly chaotic ways imaginable. I could picture what was happening inside that building right now. Tiffany was probably running around in those ridiculous heels, waving her iPad like it was some kind of magic talisman that could restore order to the digital chaos she'd unleashed. The recent graduates she'd hired to replace us, legacy employees, were probably staring at error messages written in programming languages they'd never seen before, frantically Googling things like, "Why is my database speaking Latin?" and "How to negotiate with a rebellious coffee machine." Meanwhile, the systems that actually mattered, Payroll, customer data, billing, security protocols were probably failing in sequence like dominoes falling in slow motion, each failure triggering cascades of other failures that would take weeks to properly diagnose and fix, assuming they could even find someone who understood how everything had been connected in the first place. I took another sip of coffee and replied to exactly none of the messages. Instead, I just sat there on my balcony, watching the fire burn from a comfortable distance, feeling like a retired firefighter who'd warned everyone about the faulty wiring, but nobody had wanted to listen. Sometimes the best response to chaos is simply to appreciate the artistry of it all. Monday morning arrived with all the subtlety of a brick through a stained glass window, and from my new vantage point at Benny's Cafe, which had become my unofficial office for monitoring the Henderson tech meltdown, I had front row seats to what can only be described as the corporate equivalent of watching someone try to perform heart surgery while riding a unicycle and juggling flaming torches. The entertainment value was off the charts. I got into the cafe early, partly because I'm a morning person and partly because I didn't want to miss any of the good stuff. Miguel had started setting aside the corner table for me without being asked, along with a pot of his strongest coffee and whatever pastry looked least likely to require carbon dating. "You watching the show again?" he'd asked, nodding toward the Henderson Tech building where people were already scurrying around like ants whose hill had been kicked by a particularly vindictive toddler. "Better than Netflix," I'd replied, settling in with my coffee and the kind of anticipation usually reserved for watching your favorite disaster movie for the dozenth time. Except this disaster movie was unfolding in real time and featured people I used to work with. The first sign that Tiffany had officially entered full panic mode came around 9:30, when I spotted her clicking across the parking lot in those ridiculous heels that probably cost more than my monthly rent. But here's the thing. She wasn't walking with her usual confident strut, the one that said, "I'm a wellness warrior who's about to disrupt your paradigm." No, this was more of a frantic click-clack, the sound of someone who'd just realized that all those motivational posters in her office weren't actually going to help her navigate a full-scale technological apocalypse. She disappeared into the building, and about 10 minutes later, I watched her reappear at one of the fourth-floor windows, gesticulating wildly at what I assumed was probably the server room. Even from across the street, I could see that her usually perfect hair was looking a little less than camera-ready, and her power suit was wrinkled in a way that suggested she'd either slept in it or spent the weekend wrestling with Ethernet cables. That's when things got really interesting. Around 10:15, I watched Tiffany burst through the server room door like she was storming the beaches of Normandy, except instead of military fatigues, she was wearing a pencil skirt and those death trap heels. And instead of tactical gear, she was clutching her iPad like it was a shield that could protect her from the digital chaos she'd unleashed. Now, I need to pause here and explain something about server rooms for those of you who've never had the pleasure. These are not places designed for people who think debugging means removing insects from your computer screen. Server rooms are filled with humming machines, blinking lights, cables that look like someone threw a plate of spaghetti at the wall, and about 17 different ways to accidentally shut down your entire company's digital infrastructure if you touch the wrong thing. They're designed for people who speak fluent nerd and understand that sometimes the best way to fix a computer is to sacrifice an energy drink to the technology gods and hope for the best. Tiffany, bless her heart, was not one of these people. Watching her navigate the server room was like watching someone who'd learned to drive from a YouTube video attempt to parallel park a school bus during rush hour traffic. I could practically see her staring at the blinking lights and trying to figure out which one was the make everything work again button, while her iPad displayed whatever Canva presentation she'd hastily thrown together about crisis management and positive thinking. "Why isn't the rollback script working?" I heard her shout. And even though I was across the street and behind glass, her voice carried with the kind of desperation that you usually hear from people who've just realized they've accidentally deleted their wedding photos. The beautiful irony, of course, was that she was shouting this question in a server room that contained exactly 0 people who had any idea what a rollback script was, let alone how to make one work. That's when poor Tommy Morrison, the junior developer who'd been hired about 3 months ago, and was probably still figuring out where the bathroom was, made the mistake of trying to be helpful. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw Tiffany whip around and point at him with the kind of accusatory finger-pointing that would make a courtroom drama proud. "Well, he's not here anymore, is he?" she snapped. And even though I couldn't make out every word, the tone was crystal clear. This was the tone of someone who'd just realized that maybe, possibly, perhaps firing the guy who knew how everything worked might not have been the brilliant strategic move she'd thought it was when she was riding high on green juice and corporate buzzwords. The servers, apparently unimpressed by her leadership style, responded to this outburst by throwing what can only be described as a digital tantrum. I watched through the window as monitor screens flickered, and even from my comfortable distance I could see the telltale glow of error messages spreading across displays like a technological plague. Poor Tommy, who was probably making about 30 grand a year and had student loans bigger than most people's mortgages, tried to explain something about system dependencies and automated maintenance protocols. I could see him gesturing at the servers with the kind of nervous energy that people get when they're trying to explain quantum physics to a toddler who's already decided that the answer to every question is because. But Tiffany wasn't having any of it. She was in full-on crisis mode now, her carefully constructed corporate persona cracking like a cheap veneer under pressure. Her wellness warrior facade had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like raw panic mixed with the dawning realization that those 5 easy steps for compassionate termination hadn't included a chapter on what to do when your compassionate termination causes your entire company to spontaneously combust. Meanwhile, I was sitting in my corner booth at Benny's, working on my second cup of coffee and a slice of banana bread that actually wasn't half bad, updating my resume between sips and occasionally glancing up to watch the next act of this corporate tragicomedy unfold. Life was good. Tuesday morning brought with it the kind of corporate drama that would make Shakespeare weep tears of joy. If Shakespeare had been into workplace comedies instead of tragic princes and star-crossed lovers. I'd barely finished my first cup of coffee at my usual observation post when I spotted a familiar figure marching across the Henderson Tech parking lot like Napoleon approaching Waterloo. Except instead of a military uniform, he was wearing a $3,000 suit and the kind of expression that suggested someone was about to get fired so hard they'd feel it in their next life. Vance Harrington III. Yes, the third, because apparently naming your kid after yourself twice wasn't quite enough ego for one family tree. Was not what you'd call a morning person under the best of circumstances. But watching him storm toward the building at 7:45 a.m. with the kind of purposeful stride that corporate executives use when they're about to remind everyone exactly who signs the paychecks, I knew that whatever had happened overnight had been spectacular enough to drag him out of his probably gold-plated bed and away from whatever rich people do in the mornings. Probably counting money while eating caviar or something equally ridiculous. Now, I'd had exactly 3 interactions with Mr. Harrington during my tenure at Henderson Tech, and each one had been about as pleasant as a root canal performed by a caffeinated squirrel. The man had that special combination of inherited wealth and unearned confidence that comes from never having to actually work for anything in your entire life, mixed with just enough business school buzzwords to sound impressive to people who didn't know any better. He was the kind of guy who thought synergy was a real strategy and that employee morale problems could be solved with pizza parties and mandatory fun. But today was different. Today, Mr. Harrington looked like a man who'd just discovered that his daughter-in-law's brilliant cost-cutting measures had managed to turn his profitable tech company into the digital equivalent of a house fire, and he was not pleased about it. I watched him disappear through the front doors with the kind of determined energy that suggested heads were about to roll, and probably not metaphorical ones. About 20 minutes later, the real show began. Through the 4th-floor windows, I could see what appeared to be the corporate equivalent of a public execution taking place in the conference room. Tiffany was standing at the head of the table, her usually perfect posture looking more like a deer caught in headlights, while her father-in-law paced back and forth like a caged tiger who'd just discovered that someone had been feeding him fake meat for the past 6 months. Even from across the street, I could see the veins popping in Mr. Harrington's forehead as he gestured wildly at what I assumed were printouts of error logs, system failure reports, and probably invoices from very expensive emergency IT consultants who charged triple overtime for weekend catastrophe management. His mouth was moving with the kind of rapid-fire intensity that suggested he was delivering the kind of verbal beatdown that would make drill sergeants take notes. That's when I saw Tiffany make what was probably the biggest mistake of her short and about to be concluded corporate career. She started pointing at something, or rather, someone. And from her body language, I could tell she was going with the classic corporate defense strategy of blame the guy who's not here to defend himself. It was like watching someone try to put out a fire by throwing gasoline on it while insisting that the real problem was the fire department's attitude. I couldn't hear the exact words from my cozy spot at Benny's, but I didn't need to. I could practically see her saying something like, "My brother-in-law sabotaged everything," with that same fake confidence she'd used to deliver all her other brilliant insights. The kind of confidence that comes from believing your own PowerPoint presentations and thinking that reality is just another system that needs to be disrupted. But here's the thing about Mr. Harrington. Whatever his other faults, the man wasn't stupid. He might have been born with a silver spoon in his mouth and enough inherited wealth to buy a small country, but he hadn't stayed rich by falling for obvious corporate BS. And watching Tiffany try to explain how her strategic downsizing initiative had somehow resulted in what appeared to be the complete collapse of their technological infrastructure was like watching someone try to convince a fire chief that the building had always been on fire and it was totally normal. That's when Tommy Morrison, bless his underpaid, overworked soul, apparently decided that maybe honesty was the best policy. I watched him stand up at the conference table with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was either about to tell the truth or throw up, possibly both. His mouth moved for about 30 seconds, and I could see Mr. Harrington's expression change from confused and angry to horrified understanding in real time. "No, sir," I imagined Tommy saying, probably with his voice shaking like a chihuahua in a thunderstorm. "He didn't sabotage us. He just stopped saving us." And there it was. The moment of perfect clarity that cut through all of Tiffany's wellness warrior buzzwords and compassionate termination strategies like a hot knife through butter. The moment when Mr. Harrington realized that his daughter-in-law hadn't just fired an employee, she'd unplugged their life support system and then acted surprised when the patient flatlined. I watched Mr. Harrington stop pacing and turn toward Tiffany with the kind of slow, deliberate movement that usually precedes someone getting fired so thoroughly that their parking spot gets redistributed before they even finish cleaning out their desk. His face had gone through several interesting color changes, settling somewhere between stroke red and apoplectic purple, and I could practically see the steam coming out of his ears like a cartoon character who'd just realized he'd been outsmarted by a roadrunner. The beautiful part was watching Tiffany's face as the reality of her situation finally sank in. All that fake confidence, all those motivational buzzwords, all that wellness warrior energy just melted away like makeup in a rainstorm. "General Shepard," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a sword through silk. "Sarah Chun, Washington Post. I've been doing some research since your arrival was announced." She held up a tablet with the kind of triumphant expression that said she'd just found the smoking gun. "I have internal emails from 2011. Communications between Gregory and Elaine Rowland and the wedding planning committee for their daughter's wedding." The blood drained from Gregory's face so fast I thought he might need medical attention. Elaine grabbed her husband's arm like she was trying to keep him from falling over, her perfectly applied makeup suddenly looking like war paint in retreat. "These emails," Chun continued, her journalistic instincts in full predator mode, specifically requested that Lieutenant General David Shepard's name and rank be removed from all wedding announcements, invitations, and programs. The stated reason was, and I quote, "We prefer to avoid any association with military personnel that might complicate our social standing." The ballroom went from silent to dead. Not just quiet dead, like someone had sucked all the oxygen out of the room and replaced it with pure, concentrated embarrassment. But Chun wasn't done. She'd tasted blood in the water, and now she was going full shark mode. "Furthermore," she said, scrolling through her tablet like she was reading a shopping list instead of destroying people's carefully constructed reputations, "there are additional communications requesting that General Shepard be described as simply a government contractor in any official documentation, and that his military service be downplayed or omitted entirely from family introductions." Gregory looked like he was about to have a stroke. His face had gone from pale to red to a shade of purple that probably didn't exist in nature. Elaine was making small whimpering sounds like a wounded animal, her diamond-encrusted hands fluttering around her throat like trapped butterflies. I looked at them, really looked at them, for the first time all evening. These people who'd spent years pretending I didn't exist, who'd erased me from their daughter's wedding like I was some embarrassing mistake they needed to cover up. Who'd sat by and laughed while their guests mocked my service, my sacrifice, my honor. You didn't just disrespect me, I said, my voice carrying across the room with the quiet authority of someone who'd commanded respect in places where respect was earned, not inherited. You erased me. You took 15 years of marriage to your daughter and tried to pretend I was nobody. You took 22 years of military service and decided it was too embarrassing for your social circle. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Gregory tried to say something, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. But now, I said, looking around the room at all those faces, the doctors, the lawyers, the CEOs who'd spent the evening congratulating themselves on their superiority. Now the world knows exactly who's been sitting at table 23. I adjusted my suit jacket one last time, smoothing down the fabric that had never quite fit right in this world of champagne flutes and corporate conquest stories. Funny how the same hands that had signed classified orders affecting international security were now straightening a tie that cost more than most people's grocery budget. But this wasn't about the clothes anymore. This was about walking out of one life and into another. Colonel Briggs stood at my side like a statue carved from military precision, his presence transforming the entire atmosphere of the room. Next to him, Sergeant Martinez kept that leather portfolio clutched against her chest like it contained the secrets of the universe, which, given the nature of Merlin operations, it probably did. The crowd was still processing what they'd just witnessed. You could practically see the gears grinding in their heads as they tried to reconcile the man they'd been ignoring all evening with the lieutenant general who was apparently important enough to warrant a Pentagon extraction team. It was like watching people try to solve a Rubik's Cube while riding a roller coaster. Lots of effort, not much success. Clarissa finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a croak than actual words. David, she started, but I held up one hand. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just the simple gesture of a man who'd heard enough for one lifetime. Save it, I said, my voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made smart people stop talking and smarter people start listening. We'll discuss this later. Or maybe we won't. The weight of that statement hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. 15 years of marriage, 15 years of trying to fit into a world that didn't want me, 15 years of being treated like the embarrassing relative you hide in the attic during family photos. All of it crystallized into those few words that said everything and nothing at the same time. I started walking toward the exit, my dress shoes clicking against the marble floor with the rhythm of a countdown timer. Each step took me further away from table 23, further away from the world of corporate name-dropping and trust fund bragging, further away from people who measured a man's worth by his stock portfolio instead of his character. The crowd parted in front of me like I was Moses with a really good travel agent. These people who'd spent the evening treating me like I was invisible suddenly couldn't get out of my way fast enough. Funny how quickly perspective changes when reality comes knocking on your door with a military escort and classified documents. I walked right past Ryan Matthews, Golden Boy Ryan with his Manhattan law office and his perfect teeth that probably cost more to maintain than most people's cars. He was sitting there with his mouth hanging open like a fish that had just realized it was out of water. All those jokes about being general of the barbecue didn't seem quite as hilarious now that he was face-to-face with an actual general who could probably have him investigated for tax evasion with a single phone call. General, Ryan stammered, trying to salvage some dignity from the wreckage of his evening. I had no idea. Of course you didn't, I said without breaking stride. That was the point. Past the lawyers with their corner office stories and their hostile takeover victories that suddenly seemed about as impressive as winning a game of tic-tac-toe against a kindergartner. Past the doctors who'd spent the evening comparing their vacation homes like they were trading baseball cards. Past all the people who'd built their entire sense of self-worth on impressing other people instead of actually accomplishing something meaningful. I could hear the whispers starting behind me like a brush fire spreading through dry grass. The kind of urgent, hushed conversations that happen when people realize they've been looking at the world upside down and need to figure out how to flip it right side up without admitting they were idiots. He's really a general? How do we not know this? Why would they hide something like that? Oh my God, what did we just do? The questions buzzed around the room like angry hornets, but I didn't turn around to provide answers. These people had spent the evening proving they weren't interested in who I really was. They'd only cared about who they thought I wasn't. Now they could spend the rest of their lives figuring out the difference. Elaine Rowland tried to intercept me near the champagne fountain, her face a mask of panic barely held together by expensive makeup and sheer force of will. David, please, she said, her voice shaking like autumn leaves in a hurricane. There's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, I replied, not slowing down. Perfect understanding. Finally, her perfectly manicured hand reached out like she was trying to grab onto something solid in a world that had suddenly started spinning in the wrong direction. But I was already past her, already moving toward the exit, already leaving behind a room full of people who were just now beginning to understand what they'd lost. Gregory stood frozen near table 2, his scotch glass still clutched in his hand like a security blanket. The man who'd been treating me like a fraud for 15 years was finally seeing the truth, and it was hitting him like a brick wall made of consequences and regret. Colonel Briggs and Sergeant Martinez flanked me as we approached the ballroom doors, their presence announcing to everyone within a 50-mile radius that this wasn't a social call anymore. This was business. The kind of business that involved people who made decisions that actually mattered, instead of just talking about decisions they'd made 20 years ago. Behind us, the whispers were growing into full conversations, the kind of damage control discussions that happen when important people realize they've just made a career-limiting mistake in front of witnesses and journalists. But that wasn't my problem anymore. The morning sun painted the White House lawn in shades of gold that made everything look like it belonged in a history book, which I suppose it did. Standing there on the South Lawn at 0800 hours, watching the grounds crew put the finishing touches on a ceremony that most people only see on television, I felt like I was living in someone else's life. Except this time, it was actually my life. Finally, the past 12 hours had been a blur of classified briefings, secure communications, and the kind of high-stakes decision-making that makes corporate board meetings look like book club discussions. The Merlin situation had been resolved, not through hostile takeovers or quarterly projections, but through the kind of old-fashioned military precision that doesn't make it into Harvard Business School case studies. Now here I was, standing in front of a crowd that actually mattered, surrounded by people who understood the difference between real service and playing dress-up in expensive suits. The assembled guests weren't here because they'd bought their way into the right social circles. They were here because they'd earned their place through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. The media was out in force, but this wasn't the society page coverage that Gregory loved so much. These were serious journalists covering serious news, the kind of reporters who understood that some stories are bigger than stock prices and vacation home purchases. Camera crews from every major network had their equipment trained on the podium, ready to broadcast something that actually mattered to people beyond the country club set. Military personnel filled the front rows, their dress uniforms creating a sea of earned authority that made last night's ballroom full of borrowed importance look like amateur hour. These were people who knew what real leadership looked like, who understood that respect isn't inherited or purchased, it's earned one difficult decision at a time. Behind them sat members of Congress, Pentagon officials, and the kind of government leaders who dealt with actual crises instead of imaginary ones. Not one of them had gotten their position because daddy owned a steel company or because they'd married into the right family. They were here because they'd proven themselves in the real world, where results matter more than networking and competence trumps connections. And there, in the back row, barely visible behind a wall of actual VIPs, sat Gregory and Elaine Rowland. They looked like they'd aged 10 years in 12 hours, their faces carrying the weight of people who'd just realized they'd been playing checkers while the rest of the world was playing chess. No front row seats for them today, no special recognition, no toasts in their honor. Just two people who'd spent years mocking someone they should have been proud to know. Clarissa was nowhere to be seen. Part of me had wondered if she'd show up, maybe try to salvage something from the wreckage of last night's revelation. But her absence spoke louder than any apology could have. Some bridges, once burned, don't get rebuilt. They just serve as reminders of the choices people make when they think nobody's watching. The president emerged from the White House with the kind of bearing that comes from holding the weight of the free world on your shoulders. This wasn't some ceremonial figurehead going through the motions. This was the commander-in-chief recognizing service that had kept the country safe, while most people slept peacefully in their beds, blissfully unaware of the threats that existed beyond their comfortable bubbles. He approached the podium with the measured steps of someone who understood the gravity of what was about to happen. Behind him, an aide carried a navy blue case that contained something most people would never see, let alone wear. A medal that represented the highest honor this country could bestow on someone who'd answered the call when it mattered most. Ladies and gentlemen, the president began, his voice carrying across the lawn with the authority of his office. We gather here today not just to recognize exceptional service, but to honor a man who embodies the very best of what it means to serve one's country. The crowd fell silent with the kind of respect that has to be earned, not demanded. This wasn't the polite attention you get at a corporate awards dinner. This was genuine recognition from people who understood what real achievement looked like. Lieutenant General David Shepard, the president continued, has spent 22 years defending this nation in ways that most Americans will never know, in places they'll never see, facing threats they'll never have to worry about because of men like him. Each word hit the crowd like measured drumbeats, building towards something that transcended politics or social status. This was about service, sacrifice, and the kind of courage that doesn't make headlines because the people who possess it don't seek recognition, they seek results. The president gestured for me to approach, and I walked forward with the same steady pace I'd used to walk out of that ballroom last night. But this time, I wasn't walking away from humiliation, I was walking toward vindication. For exceptional courage under fire, the president announced as he lifted the Medal of Honor from its case. For leadership in the face of impossible odds, and for 22 years of unwavering dedication to the security of these United States. The weight of the medal as it settled around my neck was nothing compared to the weight of the moment. This wasn't just recognition for past service. It was validation for every decision I'd made, every sacrifice I'd endured, every moment I'd chosen duty over comfort. The crowd erupted in applause that wasn't polite or obligatory. It was genuine appreciation from people who understood what this moment meant. Military personnel saluted with the crisp precision of people who knew the cost of the honor being bestowed. Government officials clapped with the respect of people who'd seen the classified reports detailing exactly why this ceremony was necessary. And in the back row, Gregory and Elaine sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that the man they'd tried to erase from their family's story had just been recognized by the highest authority in the land for being exactly the kind of person they'd always pretended he wasn't. The ceremony was winding down, photographers capturing their final shots and officials beginning the delicate dance of post-event networking that happens when important people gather in important places. I stood there holding the Medal of Honor, feeling its weight not just around my neck, but in my chest. 22 years of service finally acknowledged by people who understood what service actually meant. The crowd was beginning to disperse, conversations breaking into smaller groups as senators discussed policy with generals and Pentagon officials compared notes with White House staff. This was how real power worked, not through corporate takeovers announced at dinner parties, but through quiet conversations between people who made decisions that shaped the world. I was about to head toward the exit when I felt a gentle tap on my shoulder. I turned around to find a young cadet standing at attention, her uniform pressed to perfection, but her eyes showing the kind of nervousness that comes with meeting someone whose reputation precedes them. She couldn't have been more than 19, with freckles scattered across her nose like stars on a clear night, and the kind of earnest expression that reminded me why I'd gotten into this business in the first place. Her nameplate read, Martinez. No relation to Sergeant Martinez from last night, but carrying the same bearing that said she took her responsibilities seriously. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious case of nerves she was fighting. "I hope you don't mind me approaching you like this." "Not at all, cadet," I replied, offering her the kind of smile I reserved for young soldiers who reminded me why the work mattered. "What's on your mind?" She took a deep breath, the kind that people take when they're about to say something that matters to them more than they can properly express. "Sir, you're the reason I signed up." "For words." That's all it took to make the past 24 hours worth every minute of humiliation, every moment of being treated like a nobody. I read about your missions, every joke about being a weekend warrior, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. For words from a kid who'd chosen to serve her country because she'd seen what real service looked like. The operation in Syria where you evacuated those civilians under fire. The intelligence work that prevented the bombing in Frankfurt. The hostage rescue in Somalia that nobody talks about because it's still too sensitive. Each mission she mentioned hit me like a flashback, bringing back memories of decisions made in split seconds, of lives hanging in the balance, of moments when doing the right thing meant risking everything and hoping it would be enough. These weren't corporate victories measured in stock prices. These were real victories measured in lives saved and disasters prevented. When I was applying to the academy, she said, my guidance counselor told me that military service was just for people who couldn't make it in the real world. That smart kids should go to business school, not West Point. I felt my jaw tighten at that. How many bright young people had been steered away from service by people who thought the real world was corner offices and profit margins? How many potential leaders had been convinced that wearing a uniform was somehow less honorable than wearing a suit? But then I read about what you'd done, she continued, and I realized that serving something bigger than yourself, that's the real world. Everything else is just playing games with other people's money. Smart kid. She understood what Gregory and his crowd never would. That real achievement isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you contribute. It's not about building a fortune. It's about building a legacy that matters when the quarterly reports are forgotten and the stock prices are historical footnotes. You showed me that being a soldier isn't about not being smart enough for business, she said, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd found their calling. It's about being brave enough to serve something that matters. I looked at this young woman, this future leader who'd chosen the harder path because she'd seen what the easier path produced, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope, not for myself, but for the institution I'd served, for the country I'd defended, for the values I'd fought to protect. Cadet Martinez, I said, the honor is mine. Keep that perspective and you'll go far. She saluted with the crisp precision of someone who understood that the gesture meant something, then walked away with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly where she was going and why. I watched her disappear into the crowd of uniforms and officials, and felt the weight of the medal around my neck shift from burden to responsibility. This wasn't just recognition for what I'd done. It was a reminder of what still needed to be done, of the young people like Cadet Martinez who deserved leaders worthy of their sacrifice. Behind me, I could hear Gregory and Elaine making their way toward the exit, their voices low and subdued as they processed a reality that didn't fit their carefully constructed worldview. But I didn't turn around. I didn't need their apologies, or their explanations, or their sudden recognition of my worth. I had what I'd always had, the knowledge that when it mattered, I'd answered the call. And now, finally, the world knew it too.